Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Piri, and you are listening to Off the Res podcast. I'm so glad you're here for episode 2. I just want to thank everyone for their feedback and for all your support for episode 1 last night. I actually listened to it again this morning, and I was going to re-record it, but I thought, no, that's part of the journey, and we're all just going to learn from my mistakes as we go along. So, again, thank you so much for everyone for your support. I had some questions I wanted to address that people asked me. Please make sure that you like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way, I'm not having to post the videos each time I drop a new one in different Facebook groups. And also, I had people ask me if they could share. Absolutely. I think I mentioned to share with Indigenous people, but as I thought about it, we have a lot of non-Indigenous people that work for our tribes and our tribal health systems. And, this podcast might help them learn and educate themselves on different tribal aspects that might help them get better at their job. So it's really for anyone who wants to learn about tribal health. So tonight we're going to be talking about something deeply personal, but also deeply political, historical, and ongoing. I might hit some hot topics or hot buttons, or um, so there may be a trigger warning needed here tonight. I think I posted for episode 1, we're going to get real, really quick. So I thought episode 2 would be a great way to jump in and actually answer the question, what does it actually mean to be American Indian in the United States? This isn't just an identity. I want you to know that it's a lived experience that's shaped by sovereignty, resilience, policies, and survival. I've included a map tonight for a visual effect, so if you're listening to the audio only, you can always come back and see it to review it yourself, but I'm going to do my best to describe it. So in the top left-hand corner, there's a picture of the United States, and it's covered in orange, and it's titled 1492, Arrival of Columbus. Um, I'm not even going to get into Christopher Columbus tonight. Maybe that's a whole other podcast, but the United States is covered in orange. And then as time progresses on to the right, the orange keeps getting smaller and smaller, starting from the eastern border of the United States and moving westward. And that's a depiction of colonization. And as you go further, it turns into the map, the bigger map in the middle, which is the actual current day reservation system, and depicts those specks across the United States are actually tribal lands today. So if you could imagine, all of the United States used to be indigenous lands, right? And then as colonizers came from the east, they started pushing the tribes westward. Um, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but there's a TikTok video going viral where a guy's going around asking how many federally recognized tribes are in the United States. And everyone answers from, I believe it ranges from 3 up until I think somebody got the closest at 560. But I want you to know that there are currently 574 federally recognized tribes. And each of these tribal nations is distinct with its own government, culture, language, traditions, history. And also, I want to shout out that there are also state recognized and non-recognized tribal communities, which also maintain their own governance structures, cultural and identities, and even languages. However, for the purpose of this podcast, when I use the term American Indian, Native American, tribal, or indigenous, I'm primarily referring to federally recognized tribes. And like I said, we may have some guests come on to talk about state recognition. I know one of my friends is a chief of a tribe in North Carolina, and they're actually nonprofits, which I find really interesting. And then I also worked with some non-recognized tribes in San Diego. And hopefully we might be able to get some of their leadership, but that they still have their culture and their governance structure. So again, for this podcast, I'm going to be primarily referring to federally recognized tribes. You also may hear me use the term AIAN, which stands for American Indian and Alaskan Natives. Usually I'll say something along the lines of AIAN communities, again, American Indian and Alaskan Native, with the focus being on federally recognized nations. So when I do say that, I'm not referring to a single group. We're talking about hundreds of sovereign tribal nations. As Native people, we hold both a collective identity and a tribal specific identity tied to our individual nations. We also carry documentation that reflects that relationship and citizenship. We have a CDIB card or Certificate Degree of Indian Blood, CDIB. And we also have tribal membership cards. So to prove that I'm Indigenous, I have two cards. One is given to me by the federal government, the CDIB, and the second is my tribal membership card. The CDIB reflects lineage, while my tribal membership reflects citizenship. And that's really important because we are not a racial group. So, especially when we're talking about data and tribal public health, data is collected the majority of the time if it's not tribal driven research, if it's collected through, let's say you use Blue Cross Blue Shield or you want to look at the CDC data. It's usually collected through the US Census, which that's going to have to be a whole podcast in and of itself because in the last 10 years, we've known that the US Census has included self-identification along with tribal identification without tribal input on that. And some of our tribes have had their populations increase exponentially, which is not true. And so that CDC data that everyone is using, I think the next census is in 5 more years in 20 or 4 more years, 2030. Um, and we can talk more about that. If you have questions, please send them to me. But I want you to realize that, not being a racial group, that we are actual dual citizens, especially if you were born in the United States. You are a citizen of the United States, and then you are also a citizen of your sovereign nation. And I say that because I think a lot of times people don't realize how romanticized it is to be Native. 10 years ago, when you would Google Native, you would have all these white-looking women over-sexualized, used in commercials. You would see a lot of images of cultural appropriation with them wearing headdresses. Um, and people, for some reason, I'm not sure, but they feel like it's cool to be Native. And I want you to think about that because I've traveled all over the world and I still find this really interesting today. Why do people want to be Native? Why is it cool to be Native? And a lot of times when I hear stories about it, you'll hear people say, I had a professor one time ask who her Indigenous students were, and she goes, and please do not tell me that you're Cherokee and your grandmother was a Cherokee princess. I can't tell you how many times after I heard that I realized people do say that. Or they say, oh, I'm Native. You can tell I have high cheekbones. These are racist comments, but what is really frustrating to me is the fact that they're romanticizing being Native and that it's cool without also claiming the struggles and the historical trauma and the, epigenetics, the passing down of that historical trauma that we have suffered due to colonization. And sometimes when people say that and I ask them and I push back on their native identity, come to find out it was a family tale. They have no tribal cards. They don't have a CDIB card. And again, I'm talking about federally recognized. So one of my friends, and I talk a lot about it, her daughter's father is an enrolled tribal member. And her daughter, unfortunately, because of that tribe's policy, Each tribe is a sovereign nation and they get to determine their tribal enrollment. They have deemed to use blood quantum, which I'm not going to go into that tonight either. We could do a whole podcast on blood quantum, but I want you to think about that because of that tribe's policy, they've deemed that her child cannot be a member of the tribe. And whether I agree or disagree with that, I respect tribal sovereignty. I respect it, and at its core, what it means to be American Indian is tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is the inherent right of each tribe to govern itself. It means they're not simply communities or interest groups, they are governments. Sovereignty includes the right to make laws, the right to govern land, the right to determine their citizenship. And it is not for me to judge that. And unfortunately, her daughter, in my regards, and according to this podcast, is not tribal. She's not native. Now, what I tell her is she could say she is American Indian descent. And if you guys know anything about the history of California tribes, their treaties were not ratified. And so they have a lot of descendants there, and they have a lot of different politics and policies. And it'd be really interesting to do a deep dive on that. But I just want you to know that when I'm talking about American Indians, I'm talking about federally recognized tribes with people who have CDIB cards. They have tribal membership cards. And you can think of it as these tribal nations having a government to government relationship with the United States. But that relationship has not always been respected. And we're going to talk in just a second about how that history comes into play. But one more thing about tribal citizen. If you do own or do have a card, a tribal membership card, I do want you to know that it is a form of government ID. It is recognized when for employment to use on your, I believe it's your W-9. It says that they do accept tribal identification. And also, it can be used as a way to get into the United States if you are out of country and need to come back to the United States. TSA is trained in that, so you can use your tribal membership for that too. The other thing about being a dual citizen and why it's important to know this is different laws apply to you. One of the main ones is double jeopardy, where most US citizens cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Indigenous or her American Indians can. You can be tried in not only state or federal court, you can also be tried in indigenous courts and tribal courts. So that's something to be aware of if you, not saying to go out and commit crimes, but you need to be aware of where you're at and what land you're on and what's going on around you, because if you are arrested, you have to realize that you could be potentially at risk for double jeopardy. And again, not a race. What other race in the United States does that apply to? Nobody. And what other race in the United States has to have two cards to prove it? Nobody. And when we talk about the CDIB card, just something else to think about is when that was going on and those laws were being created and passed in the United States, at the same time for Black Americans, they had the one drop rule. And I talk about that because I was a professor at an HBCU, and it was brought up about, the freedmen and their experiences, which I was not familiar with when I became a professor. And me and one of the students started talking about it. And, during my history, it was so important to be 100% native or more native, because you got that recognition. And a lot of our tribal governments have created enrollment policies on blood quantum and, having to have a certain amount, right? A lot of them might go from 100% down to a half or an eighth or a 16th, where in being Black, if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black, and other laws or discriminatory policies and practices were used in a negative fashion. So while it's being used one way for a group of people during the same time to have it's, revered to have more blood, it's in another group or population that, we were very closely related to and intermixed with, that you would have to be considered black and you would lose a lot of benefits and have things that pertain to you in a discriminatory fashion. And I bring that up because doing my own personal genealogy, if you look at my tribal history, the tribal chief that I descend from was part black. So, according to US policy, would I be considered black or would I be considered native? And I pose that to my students because I would think that for them, and I ask them, wouldn't you, you know, think I was crazy if I came in here and said that I was black? And they were all like, yes, and laughed at me. And I said, exactly. So why is it okay for people to romanticize being native, but not romanticize being black? And I just want you to think about that. Um, but let's get back into the history. So again, 574 federally recognized AIAN um, nations. And then as colonization was occurring, according to the map shown, that I want you to be aware of, the United States implemented the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and then in 1851 created the actual reservation system. And when they were doing these policies and forcing indigenous peoples, starting from the east and pushing them west and creating these laws and legislation, they were also signing treaties. And that's where that government to government relationship comes into play. And we are the only group of people, because of the treaties that were signed for the display, for the taking of our land, that we have a constitutional right to health care via Indian Health Services. There is no other group in the United States that has a constitutional right to health care. Now, if you think about healthcare in the United States, that means like Medicare, Medicaid, the VA benefits. Those are all federal healthcare systems, right? But those are not grounded in the Constitution like Indigenous health, and especially Indian Health Services, which is the organization, the federal organization that is used to implement our health. So again, in 1830, the United States passed the Indian Removal Act that forced tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to start relocating west. It also resulted in events like the Trail of Tears, and I'm not just talking about the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Almost every single indigenous nation in the United States has their own Trail of Tears, and some may have more than one. My tribe particularly, we were moved from several locations. So we have several Trails of Tears stories. And these were thousands and thousands of natives being displaced, and they died during this forced removal. It wasn't just about relocation, it was actual um, specific disruption of culture, community, health, and life ways. And also think about your food. When you grow up in a particular culture, you have traditional foods. And when you're moving people from crops and vegetation and animals that they used to survive on, and you're pushing them over west, and especially here into Oklahoma, which has a very different geographic makeup than Southeast native tribes, that causes a disruption in their health. They're not able to eat the foods that they have knowledge about that's passed down from generation to generation to generation over thousands of years. So it was very calculated of the US government. And then in 1851, the U.S. government established the reservation system, confining tribes to specific geographic areas, often lands that were not their original homelands. We know that. Some people did get to maintain some of their original homelands, with their reservations, but it was a lot smaller than what they originally had. And these policies restricted the movement. They disrupted economic systems and created dependence on the federal system. This was planned. Everything was planned. Colonialism is planned, and it's not unique to the United States. I've been to New Zealand and worked with the Maori tribes, and they talked a lot about how we were colonized for over 450 years, where they've only been colonized and dealt with that for 150 years. I've been to Uganda, Africa, where they were colonized by the British, and very interesting working with indigenous people there that speak, their tribal language, their national language, and then they also speak English with a British accent. And so even though we were speaking English, they had a hard time understanding me, and I had a hard time understanding them because of who we were colonized by. And the effects of this are still visible today. There's lots of health disparities, there's limited access to care, there's economic challenges. These are not accidents, these are actual results of policy. So, one thing people may not realize again is that healthcare for Native people is not a benefit. Okay? It's not a benefit. That is a part of legal and historical obligation, again, through the treaties and the U.S. Constitution. It is not a handout. It is not free. We paid for that. The federal government has called this their trust responsibility to provide health care to tribal nations. And again, this is carried out through Indian Health Services. A lot of times I'll refer to it as IHS. Something else I want you to know that IHS is not insurance, okay? It's not insurance. You don't have an IHS card. You can't go, and walk in and get services because just to any health clinic because it's not insurance or any doctor's office. You have to go to an IHS facility. It's been historically underfunded and it often, the access to care is limited. The other thing I want you to know is that if you do have a tribal membership and are a member of a federally recognized tribe, you are eligible for Indian Health Services, whether you have private insurance through your employer or purchase it yourself. You can go to Indian Health Services across the United States. You can Google ihs.gov, I think is their website. You can look up, I've lived all across the United States from California to Virginia. I've used the system. The unfortunate thing is we have to learn the system on our own. It differs from state to state. In California, there are no IHS facilities. However, the tribes pull their IHS money and create, like in San Diego, where I worked at Indian Health Council, that is the 9 northern tribes of San Diego County have pulled their IHS money and they run their clinic. So a lot of tribal clinics and urban clinics do provide health care to those who don't have access to actual Indian health service clinics. And so you can get services. A lot of times it's limited, especially if you are not a member of that tribe. And I'll go into more detail as the podcast continues on that. So again, while there is a legal obligation, the system does not always meet the need. This is where policy, research, and advocacy all come together. And that's why this work matters. So, what it means to be American Indian today is navigating multiple systems at once. You've got to navigate tribal systems, federal systems, healthcare systems, academic systems. It's carrying historical knowledge while building future pathways. It's being a part of resilience, not just survival. And for many of us, it also means responsibility to our communities, to our elders, and to future generations. So, being American Indian means living at the intersection of sovereignty, history, and resilience. It means understanding that our communities are still here. We're not a thing of the past. We're not forgotten. I mean, people might act that way, and you will come across that because, unfortunately, American history is not taught very well in public schools, especially. But we are here. We are actively shaping our futures. We are recognizing our voices, our governance structures, and our knowledge systems. And it's not only valid, but it's essential. It's essential. So, again, thank you for being here with me today. I hope you found this podcast helpful and interesting. If you have comments or questions, please send them to me. I think if you go to the YouTube channel, I dropped my email address in there. If not, if you can't find it, it's jpwhite at strengtheningnativeConnections.org, and hopefully we can explore some of these themes and connect them to health and policy and community. So until next time, sending you love, light, and health. Take care and stay grounded. Thank you.